So I have some major concerns about allowing for in-person learning in school when the cases in the community are going up. And that's for multiple reasons. The science has shown us that kids can not only get infected with the virus themselves, but they can very easily transmit it to adults. In fact, kids over the age of 10 are thought to transmit about as efficiently as an adult. So it doesn't really make any sense to turn down the restaurants and, places of worship and some of the other places that adults go to, but not have those same types of impositions on schools, because it's just a matter of time before one single child at a school infects others, and then all those children bring it home to their parents or their grandparents. Now, of course, the other side of the argument is that kids that are not in school are hurting. And, it's exactly like with our economy. When we close something down, it certainly, does have an impact that can be adverse. But in my mind, this is a short-term solution. This is not forever, but it is probably something that is necessary if we want to adequately curb the spread of this infection.
So something that is necessary during these times, meaning going back to distance learning online?
That's exactly right. Just like we're telling people not to gather for Thanksgiving, gathering in a school is a gathering. It is people coming from many different households coming into the same environment in an indoor setting, likely. And kids have been known not to necessarily practice the best hand hygiene and not necessarily follow all the measures that we know work to curb the spread of the virus. It's even challenging for us as adults, and it's a big ask for kids. So we're essentially setting up these kids to catch the virus at school and then, bring it home to their parents or their grandparents. And I think without thinking about transitioning back to virtual learning for kids, that is just another aspect of our life that we really need to dial back on if we are going to adequately curb the infections and the way that they're rising.
And I know you kind of briefly touched on this, but what can you say about how the spread works amongst children? Does it spread a little bit faster because some of our kids maybe aren't as good at washing their hands, or how does it work with our little kiddos?
So, what's interesting is that kids over the age of 10 appear to be like little adults, essentially. They can spread about as efficiently as adults. They may be a little bit more challenging in terms of following the public health requirements like social distancing. I'm thinking in particular of our teenagers and adolescents. So for that population, the spread may actually be slightly more efficient. And it's also likely that that population is slightly more likely to be asymptomatic with the infection. So they may not even realize that they're sick. They're not necessarily following all those precautions quite as strictly as the adults. And they tend to have more contacts, because they're adolescents, they get together a little bit more, and they spread equally as efficiently from a biological mechanism. But putting all that together, it means more infections in that adolescent population. Now, if you look at the kids under 10, it's slightly different actually, because number one, the science suggests that perhaps they don't spread it quite as efficiently as kids over the age of 10. Maybe that has something to do with the way they generate the viral droplets, or maybe that has something to do with the way the virus replicates in their body, or their immune systems, because their immune systems are more immature than those of older kids because they've seen less things. So all of that could play into it. But the other thing that people often think about is the stature of kids under the age of 10. So because they're tiny and short, first of all, if they do expel droplets, they're more likely to fall to the ground rather than to get on a surface that an adult might be able to touch and then, get infected, or directly fall onto an adult's face, nose, or mouth. And secondly, again, because they're smaller, perhaps they don't expel the droplets, whether it's with talking, coughing, sneezing, or singing, with quite the same force that an adult does, who's likely to spread them farther and wider.
And one of the things that stuck out to me when I was just kind of looking through some of our stuff that we had posted about children with coronavirus, that article that I sent you earlier today, how in our country, we've now surpassed the number of 1 million kids that have had coronavirus. And then it was like in 1 week alone, we had at least 100,000 cases of kids test positive in 1 week. So what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that kind of says, hey, kids are not immune to coronavirus, obviously? What can you tell me about that?
I think the numbers are telling a really compelling story of a phenomena called exponential growth, we've heard about this in adults, and it's exactly the same thing that's happening in kids. So in the beginning, very few kids had it, mainly because schools had shut down. Remember, everything was at home, and so kids weren't having those exposures. As soon as that seed was planted in the kids, you're now seeing those cases growing in an exponential fashion, with cases begetting more cases, just like they're doing in adults. So I think the myth or the misinformation that kids are immune from this, or that kids are not likely to catch or spread this, is scientifically inaccurate. Now, the good news is that kids are a lot less likely to die from this, and that really has been a solid silver lining of everything all along, that our kids, even if they catch it, they themselves are quite unlikely to have deadly complications, although there have been people in every age group that have died from this infection. But I will say that the implications of the kids getting it is beyond just the kids. It's the implications in our community, on the rest of the people in the household. And we really have to start thinking about that, because our kids are not in a bubble by themselves. They are interacting with every other part of our community, and that's how the spread of the virus is being propagated, in some ways more efficiently through kids that are more efficient vectors for spreading the virus.
So how, and I think you kind of answered this in the very beginning, but how can we get out of this? How can we stop our numbers from surging?
It's quite simple, but it's not easy. So we have the answer right in front of us, but I know it is a big ask to do. And we have to, follow the public health measures that we know work. So with kids, we really have to educate them about washing their hands, hand hygiene. We have to be careful about sanitizer, especially with younger kids, making sure they don't, ingest it or use too much of it, because that can be problematic. But hand hygiene is a big piece with kids. Wearing masks for any kid over the age of 2, because even though they're not as efficient as spreading it, if they're under 10, but they're still spreading it, and that can still be at risk. And then really teaching them how to socially distance in a way that becomes part of their culture. So, we need to have cartoons, and we need to have superheroes, and we need to have, all sorts of different characters to really play out why we're wearing masks, why we're social distancing. It needs to be on Sesame Street every single day. And I really feel like for the next several months, this needs to be a big part of our children's culture, so that it becomes normal and it becomes something that's part of their everyday routine, and they start to embrace it. And by modeling a lot of these behaviors for your child, you can also help them to do that. So that's kind of the first piece of it, is the social public health measures. But the second piece, which I cannot emphasize enough, is avoiding those gatherings. And these are gatherings as a play date. These are gatherings at Thanksgiving. And in my opinion, these are gatherings at school. So if you do have an option to send your child for virtual learning, the less contacts that they have, the better. And in an average school day, kids generally have lots of contacts, many more than they would if they were staying at home. So that's certainly something to keep in mind.
Okay, awesome. I think that honestly hits it right on the head. Is there anything else that you want to add regarding kids in schools right now?
No, I think that's pretty good. Let me just quickly pull up my notes from the kids study that had come out a while ago. But I think we covered kind of the biggest highlights of it. I know it's crazy to see the numbers in kids, honestly.
I know, it's insane.
I mean, it's 11%, which means that 1 out of every 10 cases is a kid, Oh, I don't know if you want me to say something about the vaccine in kids, just because Pfizer actually has some kids in their trial. Do you want me to say anything about that?
Sure, yeah.
So, as we're all getting excited about the advent of potential vaccine candidates, it's important to remember that how the vaccines behave in kids is relatively a black box. Now, thankfully, Pfizer has enrolled kids as young as 12 into their clinical trials, so we will have some information on kids. But a lot of times vaccination in our kids does end up being a little bit of a leap of faith, because doing clinical trials in kids, as you can imagine, is very challenging and potentially poses some ethical questions as well. So as we think about these new technologies and these new vaccines, one of the things we're going to have to deal with as parents is whether or not we want to vaccinate our kids. And I would obviously say that if the FDA grants a seal of approval, then we really have to embrace the strategy of vaccination for our kids, because that is one of the ways in which we're going to slow the spread of the virus. And if we don't vaccinate our kids, then vaccination as a population strategy will become ineffective for all of us.